UFO. She is talking about ghosts hanging around what some say is a real-life haunted house in Metro Detroit.
Haunted houses pop up all over the place this time of year.
A new Wall Street Journal report profiles the many parents who think they can see ghosts, specters, and mysterious movements on their advanced baby monitors.
I freaked out. I stopped what I was doing and I ran upstairs and I grabbed my daughter.
Heather says this so-called ghost scratched her daughter Lily and attacked her too.
You are tuned in to the Ghost Signal. Hello once again, dear listeners, to the Ghost Signal. My name is Jeff, and I will be your control operator this morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you find yourself across the 24 time zones. If this is your first time dialing into the Ghost Signal, glad to have you along. But if you are a return listener, welcome back. This is episode 3, An Invitation Revoked, in which we will take a look into the true story behind one of the most iconic horror movies of all time, The Exorcist. I also have a listener-submitted story about a possible UFO encounter, so stay tuned. We're just getting started. If you have a spooky story or a creepy caper, or you have written a short story with a paranormal twist, visit theghostsignalpodcast.com and click the link to email me. The first 10 submittals I read on the show that also send a mailing address will get a 3x3 sticker with the Ghost Signal logo as a sign of my appreciation, and you can choose to remain anonymous if you wish. I also would like to inform you of the upcoming Patreon for the Ghost Signal. While details have yet to be finalized, there will be 2 tiers to start, a $1 per month and a $5 per month. There will be fun and unique benefits available, so choose the tier that's right for you. We travel now to Maryland for the story of Roland Doe and his battle with forces beyond his control, and the story that made William Peter Blatty famous. This is the story of An Invitation Revoked. Listener discretion is advised. Prepare for dead air.
Dead air.
In 1949, William Peter Blatty was a student at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., where he was working on his English degree. It was at this time that the Washington Post published stories about an exorcism that took place in nearby Cottage City, Maryland. The exorcism revolved around a 13-year-old boy identified only as Roland Doe, an obvious pseudonym. Being a devout Catholic, the story piqued his interest enough that he decided that he would base a future writing project on it. Blatty was a comedy writer to start, so when he first saw the following story in the newspaper, he put it in the back of his mind. So 20 years later, when comedies weren't so popular, he pulled this old scary story out of his back pocket. And while he got the idea from these old articles, Blatty's story had no other connection to it. The Exorcist is not the 1949 case, Blatty said. The letter gave me the idea, nothing more. The rest, except for the possession syndrome, which is the same all the way back to ancient Egyptian records of exorcism, came entirely out of my own head. Everything is made up. Another story of possession from 1634 also had elements credited for inspiration, the story of the Lodoon possession, which is a subject for another day. It is also interesting to note that the subject of Episode 2's Dead Air segment, Stephen LaChance, authored a book entitled Confrontation with Evil, which also tells the story of Roland Doe. Also, Roland Doe, or Robbie Mannheim as he is sometimes referred to, are both pseudonyms. On December 20th, 2021, his name was released to the public about a year after his death and was identified as Ronald Hunkler. He was an only child. His parents were often too busy with work or each other to devote as much time to him as parents probably should. Instead, he was primarily left in the care of his father's sister Harriet, who went by the nickname Tilly. Ron spent most of his time with her, and in his mind had replaced her as his mother. Tilly was a self-proclaimed spiritualist and had a fascination with Ouija boards, so since she spent so much time with Ron, she couldn't help bringing them around, and eventually Ron would become entranced as well. On January 15th, 1949, his parents went out for the evening and left him in the care of his grandma Wagner. As the evening progressed, he found himself becoming increasingly bored and decided to alleviate it by using his aunt's Ouija board alone. Soon after, strange things began to happen. Throughout the entire house, an inexplicable dripping sound was heard. But upon investigation, neither Ron nor his grandma could locate the source. When searching for leaky faucets or pipes, they instead found something even more unsettling. Grandma's favorite painting of Jesus was shaking violently on the wall as if it was about to attack them. Removed from the wall, the painting was once again pacified, and the search continued, but the source was never found. Later that night, the dripping sound had faded away but was replaced by something far more ominous: scratching. Ron's father believed that they had a sudden infestation of mice and resolved to call the exterminators as soon as possible, but they also found nothing. There were no signs of mice anywhere. Aunt Tilly wondered if the Ouija board could help. Maybe our ancestors can tell us what's going on, she thought. Ron was unsure but played along, and that was a mistake, one that proved to be fatal. On January 26th, less than 2 weeks after the dripping sound started, Aunt Tilly was dead and Ron was devastated. I could not find a cause of death online, and I think that might be on purpose. Ron became obsessed with the Ouija. He was convinced that using techniques his aunt taught him, that he would be able to contact her. Instead, it seems he contacted something much darker, and through its own misrepresentation, pretending to be the spirit of Aunt Tilly, he invited it in. Soon Ron found himself being awakened in the middle of the night by his own bed, which began shaking violently and without apparent cause. His parents saw this happen night after night and became nervous that the situation was only going to get worse, so they enlisted the help of 2 Lutheran ministers and a rabbi who had extensive knowledge of hauntings and possessions. In a meeting with Ron, the 3 holy men wanted to see if he was simply acting out as a result of the death of his aunt. The meeting was cut short when Ron began to rant in a language the Lutherans didn't recognize, but the rabbi did. When asked, he said in a trembling voice, "He has just spoken fluent Hebrew." Ron's father knew that at this moment the spirit harassing his son wasn't Tilly. She didn't speak a word of Hebrew. But his wife was not convinced and would remain that way until it followed Ron to school. His desk began violently shaking just like his bed, then proceeded to move around the room unaided, in full view of the teacher and fellow students alike. Education was very important to Tilly and would never disrupt his schoolwork like that, so when his mother had to rush him out of class that day, she had to accept the undeniable. Something inhuman is tormenting her son. Ron's sleep torments became unbearable. He would constantly thrash about in bed and rip his sheets apart. Reverend Schultz, one of the Lutheran ministers who had witnessed him speaking Hebrew, remained unconvinced. He ordered medical tests be done at the University of Maryland. The tests came back with solid results. Ron was a perfectly normal, healthy kid with no abnormalities detected. Mystified, Reverend Schultz asked his parents if he could take Ron to his parsonage for a few days for observation. He wanted to determine if it was the boy that was haunted, or if it was the house that was haunted instead. His parents agreed, and on Thursday, February 17, 1949, Ron was taken to the Reverend's home. When the sun was up, Ron was perfectly normal. He and Reverend Schultz would have pleasant conversations, share jokes, play cards, normal, average, everyday stuff. But when the sun retreated to the distant horizon, a true evil awoke and took control. It started again with the distinct sounds of scratchings on the walls. Reverend Schultz thought that the boy was just playing around and went to check on him. The scene that greeted him was 100% high-octane nightmare fuel. The bed was levitating, violently vibrating, but Ron wasn't on it. He was sitting in a chair next to where the bed should have been, staring vacantly off into space. Even the chair he was sitting in was slowly being turned over. Regaining his senses, the Reverend moved closer to Ron and saw 2 dark images slithering on his skin like snakes, leaving a trail of blackness in their wake. Schultz leaned in to get a better look, and that's when he noticed they resembled tattoos that had come to life. Then the markings began to swell. He thought to himself, what manner of evil is this? But was cut off mid-thought by a burst of warm liquid that had gotten all over his face and in his eyes. He tasted copper. It took Schultz a few moments to realize what had happened. The swollen markings that had moved to Ron's chest had exploded. Horrified, Reverend Schultz looked into Ron's eyes to see if he had snapped out of his trance yet, but was instead greeted by the reddest, most horrible demonic eyes the Reverend had ever seen. The good Reverend Schultz found himself staring directly into the eyes of Satan. The Reverend ran. Behind him the devil bellowed, uttering something indecipherable between laughs. But Schultz didn't care. He locked the door to Ron's room and called the boy's family. He was noticeably terrified and out of breath. "Shit just got real," he said. "It's time to call in the Catholics." Yeah, that's paraphrasing, by the way. Ron's parents then took him to see Father Albert Hughes at St. James Catholic Church, who was totally and completely skeptical of the entire affair. But he could see the boy needed help, so he agreed to do a pre-ritual interview with him. As the interview started, the temperature in the room began to drop, and continued to do so throughout the duration of the interview. The sun set. The tone of the interview changed drastically. A visibly uncomfortable Ron lashed out. "You bloody piece of shit! I will slaughter you and all your family and drag you to the burning pits of hell. This body is my new home, and I will raise up legions to protect it. I will never let you take this body from me." The family stood by terrified as they couldn't believe such horrible things could come from their son. Then Father Hughes simply chuckled. "My dear boy, do you really expect me to believe that a nice young man like you could actually hurt me and my family? I don't believe you." Ron's eyes went completely black as he launched himself at Schultz, but was restrained by the quick reflexes of his own father. Ron then launched into another ungodly tirade against Father Hughes, at the end of which he hissed something in Latin which translates into the phrase, "Today you will feel Satan's anger." Hughes stared at Ron with huge, horrified eyes as he stared into Ron's leering face. He knew what he had to do. He immediately ran to the phone to call the Archbishop to seek his blessing for an exorcism, as he had witnessed powers unknown take control of a young boy in desperate need of help. He got it. The exorcism was set to take place in Georgetown Hospital. Ron was brought into a private room where he was securely tied to the bed. It started well. The boy seemed receptive to the prayers and sacraments, and then the sun set. The temperature in the room began its trademark drop. Father Hughes began reading from the Roman ritual, reciting prayers in Latin designed to drive demons and devils from the bodies of the afflicted. The demon countered with Latin of its own, followed by a surprise volley of laser-precision spitting. Soon the father and his assistants found themselves dodging spit wads and threats of mutilation, but remained steadfast. As the evening wore on, the room seemed to warm up and color returned to Ron's face. He suddenly let out a blaring exhale, then collapsed on the bed. Father Hughes smiled and the assistants cheered. "Good always triumphs over evil," he said as he placed a crucifix on Ron's chest. A sudden ripping sound cut the celebration short. Ron had in one fluid motion broken free of his restraints, tore a spring out of his mattress, and slashed Father Hughes' left arm wide open. "I will never let him go," Ron screamed. The father was rushed to a nearby room where he received over 100 stitches and was promptly removed from his position as exorcist. The psychological damage done that night cost poor Father Hughes' sanity, as soon after this event he suffered a serious mental breakdown. The demon also retreated for the rest of the evening, leaving Ron to wonder what had happened. He had no memory of any of it. "What's going on? Did something bad happen?" he asked, and no one answered. Ron's parents were forced to take him home the next day as he did not need medical attention. The exorcism had failed. Somehow news of these events leaked to the press, who ran story after story of the failed exorcism that left a priest maimed and half mad. Just as the family were about to get to the end of their rope, Ron's older cousin called. She had heard about their troubles and was kind enough to offer up her house to them so they could bring Ron to see a group of priests at St. Louis University in Missouri. With no other options, and desperate for help, they agreed. On March 9, 1949, Fathers Bowers, Bishop, and Halloran came to the house to see Ron for themselves. By this time his body was deteriorating horribly. He refused any food or drink, clawed at anyone who came too close, and was constantly chanting. His chest had become disfigured completely, with bleeding scratches all over. The three fathers witnessed doors opening and closing on their own, objects around the house moving by unseen hands, and that was enough. They called Cardinal Ritter immediately following the visit and without hesitation asked for his blessing to move forward with the exorcism. They were concerned about Ron's fragile health and how close he was to losing the battle. Cardinal Ritter agreed and gave them his blessing to continue. So on March 16th, the ritual began at the house. "I cast thee out, thou unclean spirit, along with the least encroachment of the wicked enemy and every phantom and diabolical legion. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, I demand you depart from this creature of God." And before Father Bowdern could finish reciting the prayers from the Roman ritual, Ron's bed began shaking violently, and the barrage of highly accurate spit began once again. Even through all of this, and with Ron's blasphemous tirade in full effect, Father Bowdern remained resolute. Ron broke free of his restraints. He proceeded to completely disrobe himself and urinate on the Father, along with other disturbing suggestions and invitations. Hours went by. The priest's unshakable faith and determination drove them on. At one point, Ron let out another huge sigh and collapsed back on the bed, totally motionless. Was the enemy defeated? A closer look at the boy revealed two words raising like welts across his stomach: hell and devil. His eyes and mouth started to ooze a viscous black fluid. It was then decided that he should be moved to Alexian Brothers Hospital in South St. Louis, where his vitals could be more closely monitored, and more medicine and sustenance could be administered. On April 18th, when Ron was secured inside a hospital room, he screamed incessantly, apparently in pain. Father Bowdern decided not to restrain him just yet. He resumed the ritual, placing a rosary around Ron's neck, with the crucifix positioned on the boy's heart. Father Bowdern recited the entire ritual in Latin. When he reached the end, Ron's eyes went black again. He screeched at an ear-piercing pitch. Then he belted out the words, "I am in hell. I see you. You're in hell. It's 1957. He said this in a voice that could only be described as the voice of death. The room grew dangerously cold. He continued, "You shall feel the fiery flames of destruction today. I am taking another one of you with me." The rosary lifted itself up over Ron's head and smashed into a nearby wall. At this exact moment, the boy struck Father Halloran in the face and broke his nose. The priest then thought it was a good idea to restrain him. "I cast thee out, thou unclean spirit." The exorcism proceeded on into the evening. Squirming under his restraints, he began offering Latin responses to all of the father's prayers until he went completely stiff and silent. He laid as still as a corpse. Father Bowdern went over to check on his vitals, afraid that the battle had claimed Ron's young life. But as soon as he got close, Ron sat up bolt upright and with a thunderous voice stated that he was the Archangel Michael, sent by God to drive the demon out. Then another voice, completely different, answered, "We are Legion and we will never leave." The lights went out. In the darkness no one could see Ron, but they could hear him writhing. He suddenly screamed, "It burns! It burns!" A flame shot up into the air from Ron's bed and immediately extinguished itself. "Get out! In the name of God, get out of me!" He screamed in absolute fear and agony. The lights flipped back on. The temperature in the room began to return to normal. "Satan will never leave him," Ron belched. He fell back onto the bed, and the room was silent. After a minute, Ron slowly sat up and described a vision of the Archangel Michael holding a flaming sword, and was normal again, and would remain so until the end of his days. It was over. It is interesting to note that the Catholic Church filed a dossier which stated that the possession of Ronald Hunkler, or Ronald Doe, was genuine, with the signatures of 41 people who were there that day. Fathers Bowdern, Bishop, and Halloran all went on to have perfectly normal careers within the church. Father Halloran in 1988 was working in the alumni office at Creighton University in Omaha. When asked about his role in the exorcism, he attempted to downplay it, claiming that none of the events he witnessed were beyond the ability of a 13-year-old boy, including the breaking of his nose. Father Bowdern, however, insisted on the authenticity of the exorcism until his death in 1983. William Peter Blatty's novel, which was published in 1971, sold over 11 million copies worldwide, while the film adaptation is regarded as one of the scariest movies ever made, and despite having been released nearly 50 years ago, still holds up quite well in my opinion. The success of the film was instrumental in church attendance numbers rising, as well as the number of exorcists living and practicing in the U.S. going from 4 to 125 due to increased demand. Ronald Hunkler faded from the public eye and lived the rest of his life quietly as an engineer for NASA, working at the Goddard Space Flight Center for 40 years. He was always worried about his true identity leaking to the public, and according to a co-worker, had a terrible life from worry. Despite this, he would still send Father Bowdern an occasional letter, thanking him for saving his soul all those years ago. He passed away in 2020 after suffering a stroke at his home in Marriottsville, Maryland, at the age of 86. His secret mostly intact. And that, dear listener, is why you always read the instructions before you use your occult-powered hotline to the devil board. Maybe, unless you know what you're doing, just don't. The clock is about to strike midnight. Time to clock in for the graveyard shift. This story comes to us from Diana in Lincoln, Nebraska, in which she describes an incredible otherworldly display in the skies above her hometown. In it she writes, "I grew up in Atchison, Kansas, one of the most haunted cities in the Midwest. This isn't a story of a haunting, however, but it is of a paranormal nature. It was a clear, mild night in October of 1974. My friend and I were walking from a Wednesday evening church supper to a play practice at the junior high school just a few blocks away. We were visiting and laughing when we turned a corner and the neighborhood Safeway came into view. Suddenly, what we saw stopped us dead in our tracks. There, in the sky above Safeway, we saw a circle of lights that were too big to be from a plane and too high to be from a searchlight. We looked at each other, wondering what on earth they were coming from. All of a sudden, the circle of lights started rotating, slowly at first, then very fast. After that, they started zooming from one side of the sky to the other, and then vanished. Again, we both looked at each other, but this time we both shouted "run," and ran all the way to the school. When we got there, we were completely out of breath, and we swore to each other that we would never tell another soul. I've kept that promise until very recently. I believe it's important to tell these stories so that others who experience things like this will know that they are not alone. Seriously, what even were the 70s? I've seen some pretty strange stuff, but that's got me beat. And that, dear listeners, is episode 3. If you've made it all the way to the end, I hope you enjoyed it. Please email me at theghostsignalpodcast@gmail.com if you would like to share your spookiness with the rest of the world. And don't forget to visit theghostsignalpodcast.com for all the latest updates and the launch of the Ghost Signal Patreon. The Ghost Signal is executively produced by Jason Wilson, custom sound beds by J.M. Scherf, video editing wizardry by Hale, and Patreon mastery by Brooks Bigley. And my name is Jeff, your friendly control operator and your ghost host with the most. The next time the Ghost Signal hits the airwaves, we will examine the tale of Moll Dyer, one of the true life inspirations for the Blair Witch, along with a few more ghoulish goodies from beyond the grave. Until then, dear listener, ending transmission. Reach me at theghostsignalpodcast@gmail.com.
This has been a Grey Rooms production. Copyright 2021 and 2022.
The ghost signal is lost. Transmission terminated.